Good evening, everybody, and welcome to a joint presentation co-hosted by the Williams College 62 Center and the Center for the Arts at Wesleyan University. My name is Mark Reinhardt, professor of political science and American studies at Williams, and also a proud alum of Wesleyan. I'll be moderating tonight's event, which features Nicholas Buccola and Garry Bertoff. In beginning, we respectfully acknowledge that Williams College stands on the ancestral homelands of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohicans, who are indigenous peoples of the region now called Williamstown. Following tremendous hardship, after being forced from their valued homelands, they continued as a sovereign tribal nation in Wisconsin, which is where they reside today. Nick is joining us from Linfield University. Linfield is located in the traditional territory of the Yamal or Yamhill band of the Kalapuya. After the 1855 Kalapuya Treaty, or the Treaty of Dayton, the Kalapuya people were forcibly removed and are now members of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. Garry is joining us from Wesleyan University. Wesleyan is located on Wangum land. We pay honor and respect to these ancestors, past and present, as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. Now, in most US academic institutions, land acknowledgements like the one I just provided are relatively recent. They can feel rote, but one way to measure the changes and struggles they mark is by attending to the transcript of the Baldwin-Buckley debate that we're going to be discussing tonight. I'm not sure yet where we'll go, and so I don't know whether Baldwin's characteristically powerful and yet uncharacteristically amnesic references about cowboys and Indians in the American movies at that debate will enter into our discussion this evening. But I know they will be part of the event for which this evening's presentation serves as a prelude. So let me begin by telling you about it. The 1965 debate at Cambridge University between James Baldwin and William F. Buckley is the subject of a new production by the New York-based theater ensemble Elevator Repair Service. Actors Greg Sargent as Baldwin and Ben Gelosa Williams as Buckley will perform the New England premiere of their verbatim staging of the provocative confrontation between a major American writer who is one of the 20th century's most eloquent critics of white supremacy and one of the key figures as writer, editor, TV host, and institution builder of the post-war American right. The production will be at Wesleyan Center for the Arts at 7 p.m. on February 24th and 25th. And at Williams's 62 Center on March 10th and 11th, also at 7 o'clock. You can book your tickets on the websites for the respective theaters, and I'd urge you to do it promptly, as I know that at least this morning when I looked, it appeared as though the 24th performance was already sold out. Tonight's forum, The Fire This Time, takes a different kind of look at the characters and the event at the center of the theater piece, and it should allow those of you in the audience plenty of time to participate. Let me briefly introduce my fellow panelists. Garry Bertoff is an assistant professor of African American studies at Wesleyan. His research and teaching focus on Africana literature, literary theory, and Black intellectual history. His writing has appeared in or is forthcoming in Anthurium, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, South, Viewpoint Magazine, Diacritic, The Martyr Shuffle, and the Philosophical Quarterly, among other venues. He's working on two books, one tentatively titled The Black Charismatic, Demagoguery and the Politics of Affect, and the other Afro-Pessimism and Black Optimism in Africana Literature. Nick Buccola is the Elizabeth and Morris Glicksman Chair in Political Science at Linfield University in Oregon. He is the author of The Fire is Upon Us, James Baldwin, William F. Buckley, and the Debate Over Race in America, for which he received an Oregon Book Award. In the chat, you'll find a link to a discount code if you'd like to purchase the book, which I recommend to all of you. His essays have appeared in a number of scholarly journals and in popular outlets such as the New York Times, Salon, and Dissent. I wrote that, but now as I read it, I would say Dissent magazine would be incredibly pleased if the Voice of Democratic Socialism were broadly recognized as a popular outlet, but I digress. With that introduction, it's time to turn things over to them. First, Nick's going to present a bit from his book. Garry will comment on the transcripts of Baldwin's and Buckley's remarks. And then Nick's going to show us some clips from that historic event. We may have some discussion among ourselves as prelude, but the priority is going to be giving a chance for those of you in the audience to put questions to the panel. If you have a question, put it in the chat function. I'll monitor them. We'll take as many as we can. There are a lot of people attending this event. So with apologies, I know we won't be able to take them all, but we'll do our best to draw a decent sample. And tell me, send your chat to me, Mark Reinhardt, your question if you have one, and tell me if you prefer your query or comment to be anonymous. That would be really helpful. Okay, we're going to hear from Nick. I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Mark. I'm so grateful to Wesleyan and Williams for hosting this event. I'm grateful to Fiona and to Garry and to Randy and Hannah, all the folks who made this possible. It's been really fun getting to know you a little bit in our prep for the event, and I'm honored to be here to join you in this prelude to the elevator repair service production, which I've been able to watch streaming a few months ago, and I know that the folks who get a chance to check that out when it's there in person will be really glad that they did. It's an extraordinary production. I'm gonna try to figure out a way to make it to the East Coast so I can see it live sometime soon. My first job tonight is to set the stage a little bit. I'm just gonna tell you a little bit by way of prelude to Garry and I commenting on particular parts of the debate by just sort of giving you a sense of that night. I know for some folks, the sort of backstory of the Baldwin-Buckley debate is very familiar, but for others, it's not. And so I'm just going to show you, first of all, just this space to get us started. And this is the Cambridge Union that you're looking at. This space in 1965, the Cambridge Union was celebrating its 150th anniversary. So this was known as one of the world's oldest and most prestigious debating societies. And for those of you who have seen video footage of the Baldwin-Buckley debate, you'll know that the space is kind of unrecognizable, and we'll see it in a little while because it's so crowded. There are over 700 students packed into this space, and it's actually a fairly small space if you go visit it in person, way beyond the fire code restrictions. There were so many students there, all the spots in the benches and upstairs in the galleries were filled, but also the hardwood floor is barely visible because students were sitting on the floors and in the aisles. And the students were there at this prestigious debating society primarily to see James Baldwin, who was at that time one of the most famous writers in the world. Baldwin had risen to literary fame as a result of writing in pretty much every genre, writing plays, novels, essays. And I like to think of Baldwin. I'll just show an image of Baldwin as I describe the sort of introduction to Baldwin for those who don't know him too well. I love Malcolm X's description of Baldwin as the poet of the revolution. Baldwin was really the leading literary figure that was, who was associated with this revolution, the civil rights revolution that was sweeping the country at the time. The same night as the Buckley-Baldwin debate, we were in the midst of the Selma campaign for voting rights. And that was the night that's depicted so powerfully in Ava DuVernay's Selma film, the protest in Marion just outside of Selma that ended in the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson by Alabama law enforcement. So Baldwin is kind of the leading literary figure associated with this movement. The fact that the Selma campaign was happening the night of the debate gives you a sense of just how high the drama was, how urgent the matter was before the House. Baldwin and Buckley had been invited there to discuss that the motion they were asked to debate was, quote, "The American dream is at the expense of the American Negro." And so Baldwin is there as kind of leading literary voice, as the poet of the revolution, as somebody who was, as he said, bearing witness to the revolution and also taking an active part in the revolution and trying to explain what he called the American racial nightmare. So Baldwin is this internationally famous writer. The students are there primarily to see him. So had it just been Baldwin, that space probably would have been just as packed. But the students were also intrigued by the prospect of Baldwin sharing the stage with William F. Buckley Jr. Buckley is somebody who was not internationally famous yet. He's somebody who went on to achieve international fame soon after the debate. But he was somebody who was certainly famous in the United States. He was second only to Barry Goldwater as a kind of face of the conservative revolution or counter-revolution. Buckley really was a founding father of the American conservative movement. He played this outsized role as a journalist, as a polemicist, as a traveling speaker, just in every way possible promoting a conservative worldview. And really most central to the subject matter of the debate with Baldwin, Buckley had established himself very clearly in the decade prior to the debate with Baldwin as a skeptic and as a critic of the civil rights revolution. At just about every turn, Buckley was in a position of resistance to Black liberation. So he was, against the Brown v. Board school desegregation decision, against any federal intervention, whether it be by Congress or the courts on questions of segregation. He was a critic of Martin Luther King at just about every turn. He was a critic of the sit-in protesters, a critic of the Freedom Riders, against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, against the Voting Rights Act eventually later after the debate in 1965. And more specifically, he had established himself as a critic of James Baldwin. Buckley had, over the years in print, called Baldwin an eloquent menace who was hell-bent on overthrowing everything that made America great. And so the stage was really set that night for this intellectual clash, and the stakes were so high. And so with that setting of the stage, I'm now going to hand it over to Garry, who's going to talk to us about a few of the key moments in the debate, and then I'll do the same after Garry. Garry, take it away.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank Wesleyan Center for the Arts as well as Williams' 62 Center for Theater and Dance for co-sponsoring this event, and many thanks to Fiona and Randy for the invitation. I'd also like to shout out my colleagues and students in the African American Studies Department, as well as the students currently enrolled in my Black Literary Theory and Introduction to African American Literature courses. For the sake of time, I committed some of my ideas to the page, and I hope you'll indulge me here when I say that the little time we have together this evening would scarcely suffice to unpack everything that is problematic and painful with William Buckley's rebuttal, though I'd be more than happy to continue the conversation about what Buckley gets wrong during the Q&A. Then again, nothing in the world could convey an exact notion of William Buckley to one who has never seen or heard his demagogic performance, or to one who has never experienced the like. Still, with some of the time we have left together this evening, I'd like to do something a bit counterintuitive. I'd like to make some observations and float some questions that run counter to popular understandings of this historical debate. Though if you're looking for something much smarter and much more substantive than what I have to offer, then I would encourage all of you to purchase and read Nick's really incisive and brilliant book. It's an honor and a great pleasure to be here in conversation with him. So maybe this is a bit too magnanimous, and I don't mean to be a buzzkill, but I'd actually like to invite us to think more closely about a couple of things that William Buckley almost gets right, and about where Buckley and James Baldwin seem to almost agree, in spite of what they themselves might have realized or claimed. And I think that the following passages are a good point of entry. And I'm choosing here to read my own original transcriptions because there's something about the spectacle of Buckley in particular. Maybe it's his exaggerated delivery, or perhaps it's his deep Southern drawl, or maybe it's my own imagination, I'm not sure. But there's something about Buckley's affect and about his affective performance that makes the filmic experience of his words completely different than the experience of simply reading them. And from my experience, simply reading Buckley's words helps a little to blunt the lasting impact of his demagogic personality on my memory. And I guess it's also worth mentioning that the William Buckley of 1965, or of the 1965 Cambridge Union debate, seems to bear much less resemblance to the segregationist William Buckley of 1957, though I'd be happy to hear Nick's thoughts on this during the Q&A. The same William Buckley who penned the now infamous editorial in the pages of National Review, the editorial titled "Why the South Must Prevail." Now, I'm not claiming that Buckley completely reinvented himself from 1957 to 1965, but to be fair, he did change his tune a bit, though to be sure, echoes of the old Buckley can still be heard here and there. Okay, so the first passage is from William Buckley, and again, this is my own transcription of Buckley in words worth quoting at length. Quote, "It is in fact the case that 7/10 of the white income of the United States is equal to the income that is made by the average Negro. I don't think this is an irrelevant statistic. It takes a capitalization of $15,000, $16,000, $17,000 per job in the United States. This is a capitalization that was not created exclusively as a result of Negro travail. Please do not belie the fact that a considerable amount of effort went into the production of a system which grants a greater degree of material well-being to the American Negro than that which is enjoyed by 95% of the other peoples of the human race. There is no instant cure for the race problem in America. Where Negroes are concerned, the danger, as far as I can see at this moment, is that they will seek to reach out for some sort of radical solutions on the basis of which the true problem is obscured: the difficulties of white people and brown people and Black people all over the world," end quote. The second passage is from James Baldwin. And again, this is my own transcription of Baldwin in words worth quoting at length. Quote, "In the Deep South, you are dealing with a sheriff, or a landlord, or a landlady, or the girl of the Western Union desk. And she doesn't quite know she's dealing with, by which I mean that if you're not a part of the town and if you're a Northern Negro, it shows in millions of ways. So she simply knows that it's an unknown quantity and she wants to have nothing to do with it because she won't talk to you. You have to wait for a while to get your telegram. Okay, we all know this. We've all been through it. And by the time you get to be a man, it's very easy to deal with. But what is happening in the poor woman, the poor man's mind is this. They've been raised to believe, and by now they helplessly believe, that no matter how terrible their lives may be, and their lives have been quite terrible, and no matter how far they fall, no matter what disaster overtakes them, they have one enormous knowledge and consolation, which is like a heavenly revelation. At least they are not Black. Had the American Negro not been present in America, I'm convinced that the history of the American labor movement would be much more edifying than it is, end quote. So, despite their obvious differences, the ideological differences between Baldwin and Buckley, and despite the fact that they arrive at very different conclusions, I don't think it's a stretch here to say that both of them have a critique of inequality, particularly economic inequality, however inchoate or incoherent their individual critiques of the latter may be. Even though Baldwin's critique of economic inequality modulates into a critique of the public and psychological wages of whiteness, the revelation for white people that at least they're not Black, Baldwin also acknowledges the quote unquote terrible lives of poor white people. And the poor white telegrapher at the Western Union desk seems to be poor in both senses of the word. And then of course, Baldwin ends his refutation with a romantic yearning for a more quote unquote edifying labor movement. In Buckley's rebuttal, he calls attention to the fact that the average income of Black Americans was identical to the average income of some 70% of white Americans. And then he pauses briefly to make mention of the fact that not all capitalization in American history was the result of quote unquote Negro travail. Quote, my great grandparents worked too, end quote, as he puts it. Clearly, William Buckley's great grandparents weren't slaves. That said, his point about how the true problem is obscured is one to which I think we would do well to pay heed. I mean, Buckley seems to understand that the capitalist mode of production is fundamentally a labor relation rather than an extreme system of race relations. And while that might be a useful distinction, that also seems to be the extent of Buckley's materialism. And as painfully elegant and eloquent as his demagoguery was on this particular occasion, it's interesting and important to note that this is precisely the moment in Buckley's rebuttal where his otherwise seamless oratorical delivery becomes somewhat obscure, awkward, even unintelligible. Indeed, it's precisely when his audience might expect the conversation to turn entirely on the problem of capitalism that Buckley seems to do a complete about-face. I mean, if Buckley were really concerned with the material conditions of all people, quote, white people and brown people and Black people all over the world, end quote, as he puts it, then it's surprising that his critique of quote unquote capitalization runs so quickly out of steam. And I know that in the penultimate chapter of your book, Nick, you describe Buckley's point about capitalization and about Black and white travails as a classic conservative move, right? That the universality of suffering, as you put it, quote, is a useful conservative trope because it posits the inescapability of the travail and therefore makes all utopian projects seem foolish, end quote. I thought this was a really interesting observation, Nick, and if there's time during the Q&A, I'd be excited to hear more of your thoughts on this. I mean, Buckley's mimetic repertoire is clearly shaped by conservative bootstrap rhetoric and uplift or self-help ideology. But this universality of suffering or inescapability of travail trope seems to be a bit more complicated, even different, especially if we thought about the uses of this trope today and how it seems to also be used to argue for the necessity of certain quote unquote utopian projects. And again, if there's time, Nick, I'd also be excited to hear your thoughts on Buckley's accusations of race reductionism against James Baldwin. And I could be wrong, but it seems like Buckley is accusing Baldwin of being what some might call a race reductionist, or someone who uses race as a construct to explain economic injustices. And I guess I'm also interested in thinking more closely about what Baldwin might have meant here by a more quote unquote edifying American labor movement. So again, if there's time and or interest, I'd be excited for us to circle back to some of these questions. And before I turn it back over to Nick, I want to pause only briefly here to recall that Baldwin also stopped short of an explicit critique of capitalism. Again, rather than understanding the terrible life of the poor white telegrapher at the Western Union desk within the wider political economy of the American South, Baldwin pivots to a conclusion about the public and psychological wages of whiteness. Again, the revelation for white people that at least they're not Black. I mean, one could arrive at a much different conclusion. Perhaps the revelation for the poor white telegrapher isn't necessarily that she's white, but that she's poor. And maybe Jimmy had to wait a little to get his telegram, not because he was Black, but because the poor white telegrapher was tired of her job. I mean, I think we all understand what Baldwin was up to in this anecdote about quotidian life in the South. But I don't think Baldwin was self-aware of this anecdote as an emanation of his own class position, even though Baldwin encourages us to understand this as a scene of everyday racism. And quotidian life is certainly riddled with racist encounters of every conceivable kind, and some that are hardly discernible as racism. But one could argue that this is also a scene of upper class anxiety, the fear of being snubbed in spite of one's own elite class position. It's also interesting that Baldwin takes up the example of the poor white telegrapher rather than the sheriff or the landlord, who are mentioned only in passing. At one point in the debate, Buckley pauses briefly to agree with Baldwin about the quote unquote psychic humiliations of discrimination. But if we were to take seriously Buckley's own logic about how identitarianism obscures the true problem of economic inequality, then it would seem to me that he would have done better to take up Baldwin's provocation about the history of the American labor movement. Either way, I'm afraid I don't really have an answer, at least not a very good one, to the question of how this debate can energize our politics. But I am struck by Buckley's critique of quote unquote capitalization and by Baldwin's critique of the terrible lives of poor white Southerners and his yearning for a more edifying labor movement. There's something about the form or the genre of debate that doesn't really lend itself very well to agreement. Even today, it's hard to imagine new political possibilities or solidarities emerging when different factions find themselves forced to debate or to publicly fight each other, not to mention the fact that bearing witness for Black public intellectuals often trades on performing for and in front of predominantly white audiences. And even though Baldwin and Buckley seem to be on the same page concerning the problem of economic inequality, neither of them seem to understand class struggle as common ground. In fact, Buckley accuses Baldwin of race reductionism, while Baldwin himself seems to think, at least here in February of 1965, that the principal source of inequality for Black Americans is racism itself. Thanks. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Nick.
Thanks so much, Garry. Wow, there's a lot to think about there. Really appreciate all those comments. And I've made about a page and a half worth of notes here. Plenty to discuss. So certainly as folks in the audience think through some of Garry's comments, send Mark some questions, because I know we'll have many matters to discuss. So I really like Garry's point about the reading the text versus seeing the film of the debate, because it certainly does change one's experience, and the audio recording, the original audio recording of the debate is also available on the Princeton website for the book. So if you want to check that out, it's also yet another way to experience it. And so I think this is great, and I will actually show a couple of clips from the debate. What I want to do is show just a clip of Baldwin and then a clip of Buckley, and talk a bit about it with all of you, and then we'll get into our Q&A and discussion. I think there's, as I said, plenty to discuss. So I'm going to start with Baldwin, and just to again set the stage. Again, the motion before the House, they were asked to debate by these students at Cambridge, February 18th, 1965, was, quote, "The American dream is at the expense of the American Negro," end quote. And there were two student speakers, one on each side, who spoke prior to Baldwin getting up, and then Baldwin gets up and delivers his speech. And so I'm just going to play a short clip for everybody, and then just say a few words about it. Here we go.
Along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace and to which you owe your life and your identity, has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you. The disaffection, the demoralization, and the gap between one person and another, only on the basis of the color of their skins, begins there and accelerates throughout a whole lifetime. So that presently you realize you're 30 and are having a terrible time managing to trust your countrymen. By the time you are 30, you have been through a certain kind of mill. And the most serious effect of the mill you've been through is again not the catalog of disaster. The policemen, the taxi drivers, the waiters, the landlady, the landlord, the banks, the insurance companies, the millions of details, 24 hours of every day, which spell out to you that you are a worthless human being. It is not that. It's by that time you've begun to see it happening in your daughter or your son or your niece or your nephew. You are 30 by now, and nothing you have done has helped you to escape the trap. But what is worse than that is that nothing you have done, and as far as you can tell, nothing you can do, will save your son or your daughter from meeting the same disaster and not impossibly coming to the same end.
So I'm going to stop Baldwin there. The next bit is phenomenal and important as well. But I want to just stop there for a second and just say something briefly about some of the things I hear in that segment of Baldwin's speech. So Baldwin, he gets up to speak. The first thing he says is, "I'm here as a kind of Jeremiah." And this is Baldwin, who was somebody who had spent 3 years when he was a teenager as a young minister in Harlem storefront churches, announcing he's there to deliver a kind of sermon. Baldwin says, I left the church at 17, but remained forever a preacher. And he arrives in this formal debating space in this, overwhelmingly elite, overwhelmingly white audience to deliver news, right? To deliver a kind of a Jeremiah, right? About news that the audience doesn't want to hear. And the Jeremiah that Baldwin delivers that night is an indictment of white supremacy. It's about the perils of white supremacy for these two categories of people, as he puts it in the speech: the subjugated and the subjugators. And so this part we just looked at is really part of his discussion of the subjugated, this category of the folks who have been sort of the targets of white supremacy. And I think Baldwin, does something interesting. I mean, one of the questions that I have discussed, over the months, I guess now years, since the book came out, is whether or not I think Baldwin and Buckley actually spoke to the motion, and what ways did they fail to sort of address the motion that was set before them. I think that this part of Baldwin's speech is especially powerful, especially when we're thinking about the sort of mythology of the American dream, right? So because Baldwin does this remarkable thing where he talks to us about this catalog of disaster, right? The millions of details of every day that communicate to you, and he uses that language "you" repeatedly in this part of the speech, that your life does not matter as much, right? That you are a worthless human being, as he puts it. But he says, but it is not that, right? It is not that. And he really emphasizes the nightmare really here is not that you are the victim of all these things, right? That is sufficiently harassing and revolting. But it's the fact that you think to yourself, can I really have confidence that the next generation is going to have it much better than I have it? And that is, again, central to the mythology of the American dream, this idea of intergenerational change, right? And that even if my generation doesn't have everything they deserve, that the next generation might. And Baldwin casts some doubt on that. And that's something that he certainly wants this audience to think about, is what is it like? And Baldwin, of course, had just so famously used the form of the epistle, the letter to his nephew, just a couple years before the debate, in writing to his 14-year-old nephew about what the world he was entering as he entered into adulthood. And so I think that's one really powerful thing to keep in mind with Baldwin's speech. And another, and this goes to I think, connects nicely with some of the things Garry invited us to think about, is that Baldwin does devote part of his speech. The next part is this really interesting discussion of the idea of expense, right? The only time in the debate that Baldwin looks down at his notes, you can see right here, he's looking down at this hotel stationery that he kept that's in the Schomburg in Harlem, where he took a few notes about what he wanted to say that night. And underlined on that piece of paper is the word expense. And so he devotes the next part of his speech talking a little bit about this idea of expense. And maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A. But then he also goes on to discuss the impact of white supremacy on the subjugators, right? The would-be beneficiaries of white supremacy. And this is, I think, really, part of what Garry was talking about. Baldwin talks about all the ways in which those who find their value in this idea of whiteness that they are also the victims in this scenario, right? And so I think we should definitely talk about the lady at the Western Union desk for sure. And Baldwin, as Garry said, also mentions Sheriff Jim Clark, right? The sheriffs in the South. Sheriff Jim Clark was in that very moment on newspapers around the world, on televisions around the world, brandishing his cattle prod, using it against men, women, and children in the streets of Alabama, fighting for their rights. And Baldwin says when Jim Clark uses his cattle prod, what's happening to his victim is ghastly, but in some ways, what is happening to Clark is much, much worse. And that's a very provocative claim, right? Especially in using Clark as an example in that historical moment, adds the sort of the provocation. But Baldwin explains that as far as he's concerned, Clark is a victim, right? Clark is somebody whose entire sense of self is attached to this delusion of white supremacy, whose kind of understanding of his role in the world is as a guardian of the fortress of white supremacy. And Baldwin finds that to be pathetic, right? And Baldwin will say, had said a little bit, a little bit earlier, that in his notes for the play Blues for Mr. Charlie, which premiered in 1964, that when he has a character like Jim Clark, Jim Clark like figure in that play, and he says there's not really much hope for saving him, but maybe we can save his children. So again, this intergenerational thing is going on that I think is really important and fascinating. Okay, now there's so much more to say, but let me forge ahead to William F. Buckley, and as Garry gave us a great preview of Buckley as a performer, right, is adds to alters our sort of experience for sure. So here's a little bit of William F. Buckley, and then we'll transition to some conversation. So here's Buckley. And let's make sure I get this right.
Question towards some sort of a Procrustean formulation which ends up less urging the advancement of the Negro than the regression of the white people. 14 times as many people in New York City born of Negroes are illegitimate as of whites. This is a problem. How shall we address it? By seeking out laws that encourage illegitimacy in white people? This, unfortunately, tends to be the rhetorical momentum that some of their arguments are taking.
One thing you might do, Mr. Buckley, is let them vote in Mississippi.
I agree. I agree. I couldn't agree with you more, and for except lest I appear too ingratiating, which is hardly my objective here tonight. I think actually what is wrong in Mississippi, sir, is not that not enough Negroes are voting, but that too many white people are voting. Booker T. Washington said that the important thing where Negroes are concerned is not that they hold public office, but that they be prepared to hold public office. Not that they vote, but that they be prepared to vote. What are we going to do with the Negroes, having taught the Negroes in Mississippi to despise Barnett, Ross Barnett? Shall we then teach them to emulate their cousins in Harlem and adore Adam Clayton Powell, Jr.? It is much more complicated, sir, than simply the question of giving them the vote. If I were myself a constituent of the community of Mississippi at this moment, what I would do is vote to lift the standards of the vote so as to disqualify 65% of the white people who are presently voting, not simply to give.
Okay, so I could go on for the sake of time. I'm gonna stop there with Buckley and just highlight one thing before we go to some conversation. That there's many elements of Buckley's speech that are fascinating. As Garry indicated, there are moments, right, when you're sort of surprised. You're hearing some of the things that you're hearing from Buckley, and we certainly should talk about the evolution, such as it was from Buckley's 50s version of white supremacy to what he was offering in 1965. But I think you see there so powerfully the ways in which Buckley's anti-democratic philosophy is so deeply intertwined with his anti-blackness, right? I mean, Buckley in that moment, the audience laughs, right, when he says that the problem in Mississippi is not that Black people aren't voting, it's that too many white people are voting. But he was not kidding, right? He had been making that argument for over a decade. And this really, I think, reveals something that is very much still part of our racial politics. And we see on the American right in all sorts of different ways, maybe slightly more subtle ways, but it's still there. Buckley, from the get-go, had argued that his particular point of view on racial politics was non-racist, right? This is something he says with pride, that I carved out a space on the American right for responsible resistance to civil rights, for non-racist resistance to civil rights. And yet, at the same time, he says, I also resisted reflexive racial egalitarianism. So Buckley is basically always had this point of view, and I think this ran through to the end of his life in a lot of ways, even though he backtracked on some things. He had this kind of paternalism that ran through, and it was a deeply anti-democratic paternalism. Buckley was from the 50s through to the end, he was making a case that he, as an elite, had an obligation to take care of those beneath him, right? A certain kind of obligation. And that obligation, though, was one that could not violate what he called the faith of his fathers. And so in the speech, in the response speech to Baldwin, his major strategy, right, is to say that Baldwin is a dangerous revolutionary, hell-bent on overthrowing all the things that made the country great. And what we need is Baldwin to sort of adopt the posture of a latter-day Booker T. Washington, is almost explicitly what he says in the aftermath of the comment I just showed. We need Baldwin to encourage his people, quote unquote, to take advantage of the opportunities that we've made available. And yes, we should make more opportunities available, but don't push us too hard. Don't force us to do it. We'll do it in due time. So that's that's part of the rhetorical strategy of Buckley. Again, there's so much more to say, but I'll stop there and hand it back over to Mark, and then we can have some conversation. So Mark, are you there? So I just saw you pop up in the waiting room. So hopefully, is Mark back?
I believe he's just getting settled.
Okay, it looks like Mark got dropped out. Now he's coming back. Mark, yeah, take away.
I found myself telling you, Nick, that you had frozen, and it turned out it was not you that was the problem. I suddenly disappeared from Zoom. So I think one result of this may be that I have lost chat questions. So I recall one question that I'm going to put to the panel, and I'm going to invite other people to send questions to me so that I can channel them to the other panelists. It's something, Nick, that you wrote about a little bit. It was sort of a broad question about the striking camera angles on Baldwin during the video of this performance. And the person sort of said, I'm not sure if this is clear, but I want to know, what can you tell us about what he was thinking? And on the one hand, I know you're not inside Baldwin's head, but you do write a little bit in your book about the experience of the debate for Baldwin in that moment. So I wonder if you, just while we're gathering more, if there's, and I have questions for each of you, if we need to wait a bit for questions to roll in, if you'd like to talk about that. And again, if you want to ask questions from the audience, send them to me, Mark Reinhardt, and I'll bring them forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely would be interested to hear Gary's take on this too, kind of, the Baldwin reaction shots and kind of what we can guess might have been going through Baldwin's head in that moment. Just a couple of thoughts. I mean, one is that Baldwin, this debate almost didn't happen. The people handling Baldwin, his agents and publicists and what have you, they didn't want him to do this debate. And I think, it seems like the evidence indicates it's mostly because they were concerned about him sharing the stage with Buckley. I mean, Baldwin knew Buckley's deal, so to speak, but there was some concern about this internet. It's being recorded by the BBC. It's going to have this international television audience. And Buckley, as Baldwin's agent put it, was a master at getting under people's skin. And so in order to deal with him, one has to be cool. And he said Jimmy is never cool about the world's problems. And so, but there's something about Baldwin. He felt obliged in some sense to confront people like Buckley. And this is something that I think is always an interesting topic for discussion with students. I always ask students, do you think Baldwin should have been there that night, right? Invited into this overwhelmingly, elite space and asked to defend, himself, his humanity in some sense, in front of William F. Buckley. So I think there's a kind of way in which when Baldwin sits down, and there's no back and forth in this debate, right? So the structure is very interesting. So Baldwin gives this 24-minute speech, sits down, and then we don't hear from him again. And so then Buckley rises, and immediately Buckley goes, to the extreme, right? He starts his speech by saying, in order to treat Mr. Baldwin fairly, I need to treat him as if he were a white man. That's like the first thing Buckley says. So that's the first reaction shot we get from the BBC, is Baldwin's eyes opening, and then Baldwin's eyes get as big as they can possibly get when Buckley says a few minutes later, he says that Baldwin threatened America in his book, The Fire Next Time, and you see Baldwin's eyes get a little big. And then Buckley says, and in that book, Baldwin did not use the British accents he used exclusively here tonight. And then Baldwin's eyes get really big. So I think there's a kind of way in which that moment is a moment of kind of, I don't think Baldwin could have been too surprised that Buckley was taking this tack, but I think he was a little bit surprised at how far Buckley was going, that Buckley was not attempting in any way to find common ground, to hear what Baldwin had said, to engage him in a serious way. And that ends up being a symbol, right? For Buckley is a symbol for something deeper about the country, and this unwillingness to listen and to take Baldwin seriously. So those are a few thoughts on that, but I'd be interested to hear what Garry thinks about that as well.
Sure, just a couple of thoughts. I'm no expert here, but in terms of what the camera angles revealed to me, was, at least by my informal count, right, how white the audience was, right? There were some students of color in attendance, but they all seemed to be strategically placed in or near the front row, right? So I'm also just thinking about this question about camera angles in the white audience in relation to my question about how bearing witness for Black public intellectuals often trades on performing in front of and for predominantly white audiences.
So I don't know if this is a surprisingly reticent bunch, or the fact that Zoom booted me in the middle of this has somehow disabled my capacity to get questions. But at the moment, I have no questions from the floor. So, which I have just informed now everybody, but also the tech people. So while they're trying to figure out if this is a tech problem, I'm going to ask Nick, you to reflect on Garry's point about sort of the near miss, and I'm going to guess I want to ask you to reflect on that, and I'm going to ask you, Garry, to talk a little bit about afterwards how seriously should we take an egalitarian flourish from the guy who ran National Review and who, it was taken as a joke by the audience, evidently, but in all seriousness told the audience that he thought what they really should be doing is disenfranchising white people in Mississippi because too many of them were voting. Like it's most interesting when it becomes a critique of class reduction, of race reductionism in Baldwin. But what kind of economic egalitarianism can we possibly find there? That would be, different shades of the question to each of you, I guess.
I have some thoughts about the last part of that question, and then if it's okay, Nick, maybe you want to jump in after. Concerning that second clip, right? So when Buckley jokes about the problem actually residing in the fact that too many white people were voting, or that the solution, right? Let me know if I'm wrong here, Nick, but the solution might be to lift the standards of the vote to disqualify 65% of the white people who are voting, right? By which he doesn't presumably mean to disqualify people like himself, right? Who went to Yale or Wesleyan or Williams or wherever. But I can't help but think about who those standards would disproportionately disenfranchise. Clearly these comments by Buckley reek of petite bourgeois noblesse oblige, right? And they remind me of the current, insofar as we're also tasked with thinking about how this debate might energize our politics, right? They remind me of the current pathology or deplorability of the so-called quote unquote underclass that seems to be fashionable, right, among the elites of the professional managerial class.
I think they're all really good points. I think that a couple of things about Garry's point. I do really thought that was a really interesting. I mean, I had not thought about the Western Union encounter in quite that way, and so I'm really grateful to Garry for inviting us to do that, because it's, you know, as Mark pointed out in his introductory remarks, you know, Baldwin, there were things Baldwin missed, right? Baldwin was this amazing figure in so many ways, but there were certainly moments that, you know, from a 2022 perspective, we look back at some things Baldwin wrote and even said in the debate, and we might cringe a little bit or raise some objections. But yeah, I think the point about class privilege is a really interesting and important one, and this idea of a more edifying labor movement. I think that particular, when I hear that in the speech, it makes me think of actually the passage in The Fire Next Time and Down at the Cross, when Baldwin is the passage is most explicitly about the American dream. And Baldwin essentially has this explanation of the sort of failure, you know, the sort of shortcomings of the American labor movement have really being a result of the American racial nightmare. And so, and whether or not that Baldwin's explanation holds water is definitely a matter we can discuss. But I think that yeah, there is a way in which, and I sometimes, and I don't know how I feel about this, so I'm curious. You know, interesting to see what the folks on the panel and the folks in the audience think of this. I mean, Baldwin did have a kind of you know, I don't know if elitism is the right term, but if you just think about the way Baldwin was reflecting on the woman at the Western Union desk, and as an example, Baldwin would often say, I mean, one of the encounters that's really remarkable as a lead up to the encounter with Buckley is when Baldwin debates James Jackson Kilpatrick, this leading salesman for segregation, as he was called by his biographer, who was one of Buckley's, you know, go-to guys on race. Baldwin in that encounter does something similar, where he says to Kilpatrick, who's kind of, you know, a Buckley-like figure, you know, that I hold you far more responsible than I hold the people out in the streets who are part of these mobs committing, you know, acts of racist violence, because they don't really know what they're doing. They're caught in webs of delusion, and you are sort of weaving these webs for your own benefit. There's something about that I think is really compelling. On the other hand, it's a little bit patronizing too, right? It sort of takes away agency from people who are, from Baldwin's point of view, don't actually realize what they're up to. And so I think there's something there that I sort of think is worthy of some discussion, and maybe fits well with Garry's critique of Baldwin's reflections on the Western Union desk. And then one more thought, and then I'll be quiet, is on the question of how seriously we should take Buckley's egalitarianism. Yeah, I'm skeptical. I mean, I'm skeptical. I think that there's ways in which Buckley, insofar as Buckley, you know, tries to chart some sort of a middle way in his speech. I mean, when the moments when he seems kind of liberal, I find them to be like really bizarre, and I'm not sure. I don't take them very seriously, and knowing what he actually thought about these things. I mean, I think the point about, you know, capitalization and so on is you know, I think Buckley at sort of his best in terms of speaking to the motion at least in a kind of direct way. But I just think that, you know, when Buckley is sort of going on about the politics of concern and so on, I think he's trying to sound more liberal than he actually is. And I just, on the one hand, I don't know, I think he is just sort of playing a little bit there. And then on the other hand, I also think that even when he's trying to sort of be more liberal, he's being a kind of liberal that Baldwin finds objectionable anyway, you know, which is kind of interesting. But maybe some folks in the audience bought some of that sort of thing. But yeah, it's definitely interesting to see, you know, Buckley come off as slightly more Robert Kennedy-like than Baldwin in the speech.
So we have several questions from the audience that I think might be fruitfully lumped together and flow in a way from some of what we've just been talking about. It's probably more than either of you can, probably can't capture it all, but I'm going to put them together, and then you'll do the politicians thing of picking and choosing which parts make sense to you. But here they go. So one is, what do you think it would have looked like if this debate had been in front of a really different audience, all Black, for example, which would, as Garry observed, be really different from the one this debate was in front of. Another is how, and you can see the intersection with the first one, how the effect of the backdrop of the civil rights movement of that moment, how did that shape the contours of Buckley's performance? You know, and the third is, what would have happened if the theme of empire, American empire, had been explicitly drawn into this debate. What would have that enabled or made difficult for those two? More coming in, but those were three that I thought had enough commonality that we could throw them together.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in on any of the 3 points, and maybe folks are expecting me to speak to the first point, but I'll actually speak to the last one first really quickly. I was struck, Nick, by the first clip that you showed. Just in terms of the question about empire, right? I mean, I was less interested there in, Baldwin's realization that America is a settler colonial project than I was in how he described the catalog of disaster. But I guess I was also surprised that he was surprised that America is a settler colonial project, right? I'm not sure if he was just saying that for rhetorical effect, but I just wanted to point that out.
I would just, before you jump in, I guess if I could pick up my remark at the beginning, it's partly that in saying to discover that you were the Indians is on the one hand, a brilliantly economical way of invoking settler colonialism, and on another way, it's of course false. It's effacing, it's fusing chattel slavery and the economic formation that runs out of with settler colonialism and land grabs as if they were the same thing in some ways or substitutable. It's as if he hasn't worked, even in naming it, it's as if he doesn't have an analysis yet, or can't bring it into that conversation, it seems to me. But go ahead, and then I'll proceed.
No, your point is, well taken, because I think if I'm remembering the first passage or the first clip that you showed, Nick, immediately after he realizes that America is a settler colonial project, right? He describes, I think, what was called the catalog of disaster, right? As he puts it. And then all of a sudden, taxi drivers, waiters, landlords, banks, insurance companies, and the police are all mentioned in the same breath, right? And so I wonder, if this is I don't know if I want to call this reductionist, right? But I wonder, if this is a part of the rhetorical strategy. I mean, I mentioned, right, the telegrapher at the Western Union desk, right, being mentioned in passing alongside the sheriff, right, and the landlord, right? But even here, it would seem to me that a distinction needs to be made between racist taxi drivers and waiters on the one hand, and unfettered banks and insurance companies on the other, right? To put it another way, I think that there's a difference between everyday acts of racism experienced within quotidian life and the structural inequalities that manifest as the difference between being rich and being poor, right? And I tried to tease some of that out in my opening remarks.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's really helpful, Garry. And I do think that, and this is where Baldwin, in his own time and certainly since, has been subjected to some critique. I mean, Baldwin was notoriously difficult to categorize, right? And he didn't like to be categorized, and didn't, he was very suspicious of ideology and so on. And that, in some ways, is one of his great virtues. On the other hand, it does sometimes cause his sort of some of this rhetoric to be somewhat problematic, right? And maybe not acknowledging in quite as serious a way the kind of the difference, right, between these categories that you're talking about. And I think Baldwin, if he was here, he would acknowledge, what you said. And I think but there's a kind of way in which Baldwin is always trying to, he thinks the core of both of those things is the same, right? That's part of the Baldwin, thesis, so to speak. And but I definitely think your point is well taken. On the question of American empire, and this comes up a little just before the clip that I played. And Baldwin, I mean, in the beginning, he does sort of internationalize his remarks, right? A white South African, or a Mississippi sharecropper, or a Mississippi sheriff, or a Frenchman driven out of Algeria. He says all those in this context of this idea of a system of reality, right? He starts with this idea of a system of reality is going to shape how we respond to moral and political questions before us. But then he does kind of have this discussion of empire when he says, I have to speak as one of the people who have been most attacked by what we must now call here Western, or the European system of reality. What white people in the world call the doctrine of white supremacy. I hate to say it here, but it comes from Europe. That's how it got to America. Beneath then what everyone's reaction to this proposition has to be the question of whether or not civilizations can be considered as such equal, or whether one civilization has the right to overtake and subjugate and in fact destroy another. So there is a kind of way in which Baldwin is, is sensitive to that. At least that's part of, and I think that's certainly part of the way he's thinking about Black liberation in a kind of international context in the, the period both before, during, and after the debate. And then just quickly on the second question, the first question about a different audience is a great one. I have to think, the audience question matters a lot. I don't address it a lot in the book, in part because it just felt so far beyond my expertise to sort of think about the rhetoric and the audience in that situation. But yeah, I do, think that there's some points that we've made already for Baldwin to walk into that space, this overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly elite space, matters a lot. And that Buckley walks into that space and feels like that's his playground. That's what he's grown up with. He's been a formal debater since he was in diapers, basically. And so there's something about that really, I think that makes it so much more infuriating for Buckley that he loses, that we even say, loses the vote by 544 to 164. This was supposed to be his space. These were supposed to be his people, quote unquote. So I think there's something about that that's really interesting. So imagining it in a very different context is fascinating. And then just quickly on the second question, how did the context shape the contours of Buckley's performance? This goes to one of Garry's points earlier about the evolution, of William F. Buckley from the mid-50s to the mid-60s. And to me, that's one of the most interesting and relevant parts of the story, is that Buckley had adapted his 1957 piece that Garry mentioned, the Why the South Must Prevail, is so infamous because it's so explicitly racist and white supremacist, and that by 65 he's backed away from some of that language towards something different, but I think from Baldwin's point of view, no less nefarious. In fact, maybe more nefarious, right? Because Buckley is now adopting a kind of, he's not retracted anything. All these positions he's taken that I described at the outset, but he's now saying, what we need to do is slow down. He proposes soon after the debate a moratorium on civil rights laws. We have a moratorium. We've got too much going on. We need to sort of just cool our jets, and we need to also start applying these civil rights laws in a colorblind way, right? So he's adopting this kind of colorblind constitutionalism that ends up being, the sort of central, pillar in the American rights, take over the courts and how they hollow out a lot of the meaning of the civil rights revolution. So, so there's a lot going on there in terms of his adaptation, including the ways he adapts his rhetoric for his run for mayor of New York later in 65, which is another topic. So I'll stop there.
So we're going to take one more question. I'll thank the audience for patience because we're at time, but we're going to take one more. I'm going to ask you two to be, it's a big question. I'm going to ask you to be brief. I'm going to apologize. Questions are pouring in. So now, as we approach time, and there's some great ones. We obviously can't do most of them. I'm once again going to smush two together, but this really is one question, not two. Someone asked really interestingly, drawing on Saidiya Hartman, a Wesleyan alum, I'll point out for those who don't know that, how much Buckley's words were meant as a provocation to make a spectacle out of Baldwin. And I want to use that as the background to the other piece of it from someone else, which I think you can take up. And it's in a kindred spirit. It says, what's the utility of engaging with those like Buckley who argue in bad faith? Buckley's reliance on provocative statements, supposed jokes that belie true beliefs is a tactic that is perhaps even more common today. And the question was, is there anything we can learn from Baldwin's response? Now, it's not literally the case that Baldwin responds because Buckley stops and then they vote and Buckley loses, but they're speaking to each other in the context of the debate, and Baldwin's presentation is obviously shaped by the knowledge that Buckley, being Buckley, is going to do that kind of thing. So I think it's actually a fair question in that way. And I at least think it's a fair question to say there's an element of bad faith in there, and even one that we might benefit from drawing on Saidiya Hartman to think about. So if we think of Baldwin as modeling responses to bad faith argument, are there lessons for a president that is certainly full of moments of bad faith in politics?
What do you want me to jump in, Garry? Okay. Yeah, great question. Yeah, I think it's difficult to you know, I wouldn't dispute that there are many ways in which Buckley is operating in bad faith, and this question that kind of hangs over not only this debate but other engagements that Baldwin had is, you know, was he sort of dignifying the position of Buckley, or was he dignifying Buckley by even agreeing to appear with him at all? And I have to be honest, I go back and forth on this question. And one of the things I find myself asking, you know, is why did Baldwin feel compelled to engage in these conversations? And I think his view did change a little bit about this in the years after the Buckley debate. But I think, you know, and I think there's a couple of things. I mean, Baldwin says in 65, especially when we're thinking about these engagements, the sort of 62, 63, 64, 65, Baldwin is in this mode where I think he does have a kind of hope, right? He says in The Fire Next Time, right, I have to believe that people can be better than they are, right? He really is, you know, trying, you know, in so many ways to just get through to people who he thinks have been unwilling to listen. And I think that there's a moment at the end, toward the end of his speech, which, you know, Baldwin says, you know, what concerns me most, right? This is the thing that he, you know, I end up titling the chapter about Baldwin's speech, what concerns me most. He says, what concerns me most is that we will be so unwilling, you know, there's just going to be unwillingness to listen to each other. The very authority of reason, of discourse will break down, right? And so that, and clearly, but he doesn't name Buckley, right? But Buckley is definitely, I think, exhibit A of this. And one thing I point out in the, you know, conclusion of the book is they appeared one more time together a few months later on an American television show, and it was a back and forth, much more of a back and forth. And by everyone's account, including Baldwin's, it was Buckley's night. Buckley kind of won the debate, so to speak. And Baldwin says, when he reflects on it, that he sort of tuned out of the debate at one point because he recognized that Buckley was unwilling to listen, and there was really no point in trying to convince him of anything. And Baldwin says, I should have hit him over the head with my coffee cup, right, is what I should have done. And Baldwin, of course, was making a joke there, but his point was quite serious. And so, yeah, I think that one thing I recommend to people is that, you know, definitely they should read Saidiya Hartman for sure. Eddie Glaude's book, Begin Again, kind of picks up where The Fire Is Upon Us leaves off. I mean, it concludes, you know, in 1965 with a little bit of the aftermath and the epilogue. But yeah, Eddie Glaude's book really picks up, you know, Baldwin in the kind of late 60s, early 70s. And in many ways, he had shifted, right? That idea that I have to believe human beings can be better than they are. He hangs on to that, but he also says by 68, his hope, you know, for human beings being better than they are had taken a significant hit for all sorts of reasons. So I think that's definitely something worth thinking about. And then we have to confront the question of which of these engagements are worthwhile, and what do we do with the problem of somebody who's operating in bad faith? Do we try to expose that publicly when we can, or do we refuse to engage? I mean, I think those are all sorts of big, you know, moral questions that Baldwin can help us think through them, but he certainly can't answer them for us.
Yeah, no, both of these are really thoughtful questions. Thank you to whoever asked them. I have a good sense of who might have asked the last one, but let's see. I mean, I think that one of the important lessons of Hartman's first monograph is that sometimes we need to turn to forms, into places, into spaces, into people where the thing that we're looking for is hardly discernible, right? And so, you know, rather than going to this spectacular, right, form of the debate, right? And I'm even now like struck by the fact that, like, I think the etymology of debate is, right, to fight, right? But rather than turn to like spectacular forms that are meant for the consumption, right, of the shocking and the terrible, we need to find new forms, right? You know, one of the things I mentioned at the very end of my, you know, opening remarks, right, was that it's hard sometimes to imagine new productive political possibilities emerging when different factions find themselves forced to speak to each other, let alone debate each other, right? And so, right, I think that we need to sort of turn to other places, right, to think about politics that are outside of the spectacular, right? And, you know, folks have been doing this work for a long time,
So thank you both with that. We are not only at time, but past time. The people who monitor these things say we have a surprisingly low amount of drop off, despite keeping here for longer than advertised. I'm going to note two things. First, I want to thank everybody who came. I want to encourage those of you who found any of this interesting or find Baldwin and or Buckley interesting, again, to attend the elevator repair services performances at Wesleyan on the 24th and 25th of this month, and at Williams on March 10th and 11th. And Nick, out of bottomless authorial enthusiasm or generosity, has offered to stay on for informal conversation. I ignored a lot of questions, and one came in, what do you mean by bad faith? How do we know what's bad faith? There's a much longer list than that. Nick is happy to stay and talk with people. I think in that reduced, more informal context, I think we can just have people unmute themselves and ask you things if that makes sense. If it would help for me to stay around for a few minutes for that, that's fine. I'm going to thank our hosts, everybody who made this possible. I want to thank you for coming. I will declare the official part of this event over, but as the pitchmen say, but wait, there's more.